Thanks, Ian, and thanks to all you guys. I've enjoyed the conference so far, and I do wish we could have been in person. The REMI conference is always a lot of fun, so I do regret that, but hopefully next year, and hopefully this plague will be over by then. And by the way, we did fill out our census forms. So okay, so anyway, so this is a project that I did for Jasper County, South Carolina, and included the county government school district and also the two municipalities within Jasper County, Hardeeville and Ridgeland. And by the way, if I have time at the end of my presentation, I may hit on one of the municipalities, but if I don't, I am doing a webinar next month. A quick plug there, so I'll include those in that. So, okay, all right, let's get here. So click. Okay, so just a quick geography. I always like to do this. The blue dot over here is where I am, of course, and Jasper County is down here. If you're actually driving up I-95 from Savannah going north, when you go crossing the South Carolina, that's Jasper County. That's where you are. It's adjacent to Savannah, Georgia, and also to Hilton Head. The Hilton Head Bluffton. It's part of the Hilton Head Bluffton Beaufort MSA, and so it does have a really strong economic connection to the Hilton Head area and Savannah as well. So, and of course, the Port of Savannah being down there is important, especially with some of the development that's actually being planned right now in Savannah. In Jasper County. So, what we did was actually there was a study that was done by some of my former colleagues at the Strom Thurmond Institute, which was the research institute that I used to be a part of before it basically went the way of the dodo. But the Thurmond Institute study that my colleagues did a fiscal projection for Jasper County and the two municipalities, did not include the school district at that time. And they used a totally different methodology. They basically did a comparison with peer communities, and based on population projections, determined fiscal needs from that. I, of course, used REMI and built some fiscal projections off of the REMI PI Plus model, and based it off of the certified annual financial reports, or Kaffirs, from each municipality, each governmental unit there, and did the projections, basically just taking the Kaffirs, putting them in the spreadsheets, and then projecting them into the future. And the Kaffirs really only cover general fund items, so that's all I really covered. I didn't get into capital expenses, things like road construction, that sort of thing. I really just dealt with operational type revenue and expenditures. So and by the way, actually, I think I left something off the bottom here. No, that's on the next slide. Okay, so so I use the main REMI projections I use for doing the fiscal modeling, which is basically what mainly impacts the revenue and expenditures within the government's budget, is population total for the county municipal governments, and then the school age population for the school district, which I'll kind of go in more detail about that in a minute. Then I use residential and non-residential capital stock, which is basically property tax base. That is the value of existing, of actual capital stock of existing properties in the county, and then the output. And output, of course, is total sales, and that, of course, is going to tie into some of the more economically oriented stuff, like like local option sales taxes and that sort of thing. And then some of the items there actually did not have a clear trend. There was no real correlation. Basically, I built a correlation between, basically like a simple regression, basically between the particular revenue or expenditure item with the different measures in REMI to determine which one would show the best fit. And some of them really just don't have a clear trend. Even if you just eyeballed the trend over time, there's no clear trend. And so those I actually averaged over historic years. And I made assumptions when I was doing that to make sure I kept the model reasonably conservative. There's a principle that I actually learned years ago that accountants use called the prudence principle. And that's the concept of, where there's a more conservative option, as far as your projections, you take the more conservative option. And it's just much better to have people come back and say, oh, your projection was actually a little bit low, and come back and say, wow, you really overshot that. So I prefer to take the more reasonably conservative. By reasonably conservative, I basically mean that I try really hard not to overestimate revenues or underestimate expenditures. Also assume no millage rate or other funding formula changes after 2019, which is the last historic year I had for the Kaffirs. And basically what that means is essentially the correlation that I found in 2019 between the budget items and my projections were going to be what the indicators are going to be the same. Of course, everything's made in 2017 dollars. And also the last historic year in REMI, of course, is a couple of year lag. And actually, I think the model that I used actually, I can't remember if it was 2015 and 2016 was the last historic year for the model I used. And so what I did is actually contacted the Regional Development Alliance down in that area, which is the Southern Carolina Regional Development Alliance. And they were very, very kind to actually share some information with me, a lot of which actually is confidential. So I actually cannot share the information shared with you directly, but they shared the information with me about upcoming investment that was coming to the area, jobs and that sort of thing. So I was able to actually build that into the REMI model to actually update the baseline to or the standard regional control to get up to speed. And of course, I actually did this. I actually completed the initial analysis in February. And as they say, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Well, nobody expects a global pandemic either. And so, of course, this nosedive, of course, hit right after I'd finished the analysis. So essentially, I started, just kind of going back and kind of adjusting my projections for COVID as I could. And then, of course, REMI actually released an adjusted model. I forget exactly when that came out, maybe in June, I think. But REMI actually did some updates for the standard for the regional control with the working the pandemic in. So I actually redid the models, and then what I presented them and what I'll present to you actually you'll have at least actually see two sets of results. You'll see the ones that are the pre-pandemic and the ones that are post-pandemic. And I just have the two graphs on the same slide. And I'll just show that to you in a moment. So the projections that I came up with here from my modeling. Well, first I'll show you this is actually from the report. I actually left the table title in there. So the others I took the table title out, but left it in this one. But this basically just shows what I correlated all the items within the Kaffir to within the REMI model. And you see, obviously, ad valorem, which is property taxes, is, of course, indexed to non-residential capital stock. And I'll explain the non-residential part in a minute. Actually, on my conclusion slide, I'll elaborate that on a little bit, because that actually is a matter of state law, and that actually is a major issue when it comes to school district funding. And so I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And then, of course, I did some things you see actually were average because they showed no trend. A lot of things were indexed to enrollment as well, especially expenditure items, particularly, especially the general instruction type stuff, and support services are primarily indexed to enrollment. So those are the big things. Like I said, these other things are things that are either purely discretionary or they just had no trend whatsoever. So with the Jasper County School District, enrollment growth turned out to be a little bit of an issue because typically, what you would need to do is essentially just correlate the expenditures for these different items with the increase in the school age population, which REMI, of course, gives you, a very, year by year breakdown. So you can actually do your school age population projections, by grade. But the issue with that is that Jasper County School District's enrollment growth actually does not follow historically does not follow the growth in school age population. Reason for that is that there actually are 2 state charter schools located in Jasper County, and there are also two private schools, one of which is fairly large. And so those actually take a lot of the students away from the public school district. So the public school district actually only educates a proportion of the school age population in the county. So to accommodate that, I had to look at historic ratios of enrollment to school age population for each grade group. And I did it according to elementary school, junior high school, and high school, and K4 and 5. And so so that's what I actually based enrollment growth off of. The projections for the school district, since it was based strictly on non-residential capital stock, the capital stock was relatively flat in its growth rate for non-residential. I mean, there was some growth that wasn't huge. And so so actually the expenditures expected to grow faster than revenues were going to grow. And Act 388 is actually the law that pertains to taxation. This year I'll talk about in a minute. I put this on here as a teaser. This slide I'm actually using parts of the slideshow I used for the county council, and I presented it to them last week. So that was meant to be a teaser for them, because I knew as soon as I mentioned Act 388, I'm gonna get some nods from them. So they know exactly what's coming up. But these are the projections. The top graph is my projection from before the plague hit, and the bottom graph is actually the revised with the adjustments that REMI made to the model. And you can see basically the historic years are the dark and the orange lines there. In both of them, obviously those are the same, since history didn't change. But the green line is the projected revenue, and the blue line is projected expenditures. And you see I projected initially the school district to basically go into essentially deficit given its current funding formulas by 2022. With COVID, with the effects that they had on the economy, that has bumped the point at which the school district is projected to go into deficit by 2020 into 2021. So it bumped it up a year. And you notice also that the blue line, the projected expenditures, actually is growing a good bit faster in the post-COVID model, whereas of course the revenue line is growing a little bit flatter. And revenue line, of course, it makes sense, because of course the economic effects of COVID clearly is going to suppress a lot of the revenue sources. But the blue line takes a little explanation, the expenditure line, and that's because the population in Jasper is actually projected to increase at a more rapid rate post-COVID than pre-COVID. And the reason for that is, of course, I think Scott Nystrom talked about this on Wednesday. Jeff actually referenced back to Scott a minute ago, and now I'm referencing it. But essentially, what happened with COVID is a lot of people are moving away from the denser urban areas to the less dense areas. So Jasper is actually projected to be one of the beneficiaries of this. So that increase in population, even though of course the school district isn't catching all of the children coming into the area, they're still getting a faster than previous growth rate. So the expenditure line is growing a little faster there. Okay, now the county government. The county model is a little more complicated. In some ways, the school district model is complicated, not in the sense of the metrics you use. In that sense, it's a little bit simpler, but it's more complicated in the sense that the funding sources for our school districts are so convoluted in this state. And I'm not sure how it is in other states, but you have such a mix of local funding and then all these different state funds that go in. And so the school district modeling is actually very complicated, even though when you finally actually get into the actual REMI portion of the model, it's relatively simple. It's the pre and post REMI run that gets complicated. Jasper County is a little more complicated because you have to use more different variables, because there are more services that are involved that aren't specifically tied to population necessarily. So here, of course, the taxes, of course, are taxes were not broken down in the Kaffir by property tax versus other sources. But residential, non-residential capital stock did have the best correlation. So the tax revenue is projected off of the capital stock or the tax base. Fines, fees, and licenses show no real trend, and that they're really, logically, there isn't necessarily a good one to tie it to. So I averaged that one. Intergovernmental, I assume to be tied to population, which that one had a good fit. And miscellaneous was just a small category, had some things in it some years and some years that didn't, so I just excluded it. And that was kind of a conservative kind of move there. And so then you see some of the other things like administrative services, tax collector, all that stuff, tied largely to population, local government employment, which REMI gives you, and of course some other things are tied to output and that sort of thing. And again, you see here, here's the rest of it. So the population for Jasper County is projected to grow by about 7,000 people, which is percentages. I can't do that in my head, but that's a pretty decent percentage growth in population. And by the way, this population growth projection, this is the post-COVID population growth projection. So this is a little bit larger than it was before. I don't recall what the previous number was, but it's a little bit larger. right now, as of the 2019 census estimate, it's around 30,000 population in Jasper. So it's a projected increase by about 7,000 over the next 5 years. The tax revenue, the property tax base is projected to grow but modestly. So ad valorem tax revenue is projected to grow at a relatively slow rate. And expenditures are expected to grow a little bit faster than revenue, but the county actually is in pretty good financial state right now. So I actually projected they're actually going to remain in a surplus given their current, millage rates and everything and other funding formulas, really throughout 2020 until about 2025. Somewhere between 2024 and 2025, I projected them pre-COVID to essentially balance their budget to the point to where they'll need to actually make some adjustments to their funding formula. But COVID, of course, bumped that up by a couple of years. So it bumped it up to 2023 is the point now where they're going to have to start looking at changing some of their funding formulas, maybe a millage increase or something of that nature. And of course, you can kind of see again the effects that COVID had. The projected revenue flattened out some, just like in the school district, and the projected expenditures went up some. So again, a lot of that is tied to the projected increase in population that REMI is projecting as a result of the pandemic. Okay, so another thing that I actually did, and this was to help to update something that was done in the previous study, which was done in 2006. So it's been about 14 years ago since that previous study. They did a staffing needs projection for fire and rescue in the sheriff's department. And at that time, that previous study was actually done right before the Great Recession hit. And I did kind of make a comment to the county council that, it has got me a little paranoid now because, of course, they did the study in 2006 and we had a major recession right after it. And here I did this study, finishing up my initial analysis in February, and then we had a major recession that hit immediately after that. So, but the population projections were actually showed much faster growth in 2006. And so they had projected a pretty substantial increase in needs for fire and rescue. So that needed to be updated because of population growth as a result largely of the recession in the late 2000s didn't pan out. And so basically the current employment, basically what I did is I just looked at I correlated, and both of these correlated to population very well. So I used population as the metric and just looked at the historic correlation between population and fire and rescue staff and sheriff's department staff, and just projected that into the future. And so that's basically just shows the additional personnel that we'll need to hire for those departments. The other thing that I did to update the previous study was to determine a break-even home value. And the break-even home value is basically just is how much how a home needs to be worth in assessed value or market value in order for it to make enough property tax revenue to cover the cost of the additional residents moving into the county. So this essentially means a new household moving into the county that wasn't there before, and how much are they costing the county by being there, and how much does that house need to be worth in order to generate enough revenue just simply from property tax. This isn't counting other revenue sources they might generate. And basically, I basically assumed the census average 2.58 persons per household, and then built that into my projection model, and then just saw how much it generated in terms of cost, and then of course I just calculated the property tax revenue that was necessary to cover that cost. And so you see a new home basically, for the county government at least, needs to be about between 140,000 to 147,500. Depending on whether it's a new construction or not. New construction obviously costs more because you have to have sewer taps and stuff like that. Municipal impact is actually a lot higher. You'll have to wait until the webinar to see that one. But that actually is a good bit higher than it was in the previous model. And I don't have time to hit the municipal model, so I will just save that for the webinar as well. Sorry. And I just hit this conclusion slide just to kind of explain some of the reasons for these things. First of all, the reason the break-even home value is increased is both of these apply to Act 388, this one, and also the impact on the school district. One of the things Act 388 did was it put a 15% assessment cap on whenever counties or the county or municipal governments go, where county governments actually run reassessments for municipal government. So whenever the county reassesses the property within that county every 5 years, they can only increase that property value by 15%. It doesn't matter if the property value actually increased by 50%. They still can only increase it by 15%. And even then, there are some regulations about, you know, they can't necessarily take a windfall from that either. And except in very relatively specific circumstances, they have to actually adjust millage rates to actually make it more or less revenue neutral. And so, so basically that, and along with the inflation and the normal appreciation of home values over the time period since 2006, has led the break-even value to actually increase substantially since 2006. The school district, the biggest impact of Act 388 is on the school district. I'm nearly out of time. Let me just wrap this up real quick. The school districts under Act 388 of 2006 actually cannot tax primary residential property for its operating revenue. They can do it for capital debt when they build a new school, but as far as actual operating revenue, they cannot tax residential property and property taxes. And so that's why that model was limited to non-residential capital stock. And so so of course this causes a big issue, because of course where's the demand coming from more school district public school provision? Well, it's coming from more residents coming to the area, but they're not actually paying the taxes that are covering that. So it kind of disconnects the source of the demand with the source of the operating revenue. There is a pot that is actually filled by a 1% statewide sales tax that's supposed to make up for that loss of revenue, but most school districts will tell you that actually has not panned out, and a lot of them are actually losing money off of Act 388. So a lot of the school district projections that I have are very heavily impacted by this. And I think I might have done a webinar maybe a year or two ago about this before, about the effect it actually has on so-called bedroom communities, as opposed to communities that have much more commercial development. So anyway, that's a big issue there. So, and of course, COVID-19 effect is a big effect as well, obviously. So that's my my slideshow, and thank you guys for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation.